The year is 2019, and CRT televisions are widely considered antiques of the previous century. But within the competitive Melee community, CRTs are considered the definitive way to play the game. To this day, Melee players remain loyal to CRTs due to their unmatched gameplay performance, even though the rest of society moved on to LCD monitors years ago. Several prominent tournament organizers have attempted to convert the Melee community to slimmer and sleeker LCDs as well, citing the difficulties of storing and transporting CRTs as their reasoning. Yet, these efforts have almost always been met with backlash from professional players. The opinion that LCDs compromise the quality of the gameplay remains the consensus, even though it is rarely scientifically backed. Precisely what is wrong with LCDs, let alone what could be done to fix them, has been absent throughout these discussions. As a result, the Melee community has failed to adopt LCDs in any meaningful capacity. I myself was a CRT loyalist until recently when I began to look for alternatives out of necessity. In April 2018, a legendary venue called Nebulous closed its doors, and my local scene ended up being unable to find a suitable replacement. In modern-day New York City, there simply aren't any locations that are willing to rent the space needed to host tournaments on CRTs. After an entire year went by without any progress, I decided to get together with some friends of mine to find a solution. Since then, we've been able to flip the script on the state of Melee in New York City. Not only were we able to find a viable CRT alternative, but we were also able to partner with Operating System and all-new LAN Center in downtown Manhattan. Now we're looking forward to starting something great at our best venue yet. In this video, I'll be explaining the research that was necessary to turn things around. Hopefully this information will lay the groundwork for those who are interested in hosting Melee tournaments without CRTs. When it comes to playing Melee on LCD monitors, HDMI converters are necessary pieces of equipment. I was initially cautious about the manufacturer's claim that HDMI converters do not introduce latency, as my own experiences with them had suggested otherwise. This claim is entirely accurate upon further inspection, however. Earlier this year, Cardano used an oscilloscope to prove that the latency introduced by HDMI converters is so insignificant that it can effectively be written off as zero. This means that any latency-related complaints must stem from the LCD monitors themselves. Eventually, I would learn that LCD monitors are inherently problematic when it comes to latency and reaction time. In order to understand why, let's take a moment to learn about how CRTs and LCDs draw visuals. The goal of either a CRT or LCD that is running Melee is to produce 60 high-quality images per second. This creates the illusion of fluid visuals, similar to a flipbook. The difference is that, unlike flipbooks, CRTs and LCDs cannot draw entire images all at once due to hardware limitations. Instead, CRTs and LCDs use their own unique methods to bypass these limitations and achieve a similar effect. On a CRT, a scan line spawns at the top of the screen at the beginning of each frame. From there, the scan line pans down to the bottom of the screen over the course of a frame. At any given moment in time, this scan line causes the CRT to display a thin line of visuals that is fully constructed on the spot. Even though the CRT screen is mostly empty as this happens, the human eye is able to piece the thin lines of visuals together in order to see complete images. Because of the method CRTs use to draw images, it is easy to determine when the human eye is provided with a stimulus to react to. A CRT's visuals are binary, meaning they are either present or not present. There is no variation in terms of the quality of the visuals, which means there is no ambiguity. On an LCD, this is not the case. Most notably, LCDs are able to display graphics that cover the entire screen at once. These graphics are still prompted by a scan line that pans down once per frame. However, this scan line behaves differently from a CRT's. Whereas a CRT's scan line causes graphics to display immediately, an LCD's scan line causes the LCD to transition its graphics from the previous frame to the new frame. This transition takes additional time to complete. Furthermore, while the transition happens, the LCD will display an image of the previous frame and the new frame being meshed together. The new frame may not yet be discernible to the human eye during this time. Based on this information, LCDs are clearly less favorable for evoking reactions than CRTs. The only question is, by how much? To answer this question, Cardano conducted tests on one of the most popular BenQ monitors on the market. Cardano used an oscilloscope to make the following estimations about the BenQ's graphical transition. 4 milliseconds after the BenQ scan line passes by, the the new frame of visuals is approximately 50% visible. 6 milliseconds after the scan, the new frame is approximately 80% visible. Finally, 15 milliseconds after the scan, the new frame is 100% visible, and the previous frame is no longer visible. The new frame then remains distinctly visible until this process repeats itself a few milliseconds later. Going back to our mental model from earlier, the BenQ scan line leaves behind a gradient that represents its graphical transition. Most of the transition takes place towards the beginning of the gradient, but the process does last a total of 15 milliseconds. At some point, the human eye receives a stimulus that it is able to react to, but it isn't entirely clear when that happens. The problem is that we may never know exactly when this stimulus shows up. People have theorized that the 6 millisecond threshold is the bare minimum, but there is no way to fully rule out the rest of the 15 millisecond range. For this reason, there will always be a degree of subjectivity when assessing how laggy LCDs really are. That brings me to my hypothesis, which is that regardless of exactly where the stimulus falls, LCDs do add a perceptible amount of latency. It should be understood that as minor as the latency in contention may sound, every millisecond matters in a game that constantly pushes players to the brinks of their reaction times. Several examples of increased latency being poorly received already exist within Melee. These include raising the buffer on netplay and switching to less preferable CRT models. Both of these procedures are known to increase latency by merely a few milliseconds, yet pro players are consistently able to notice. It stands to reason that despite the Melee community's need for LCDs, they will never replace CRTs if they come at this expense. The origins of solving the dilemma with LCDs date back to a similar dilemma from 2016. Just a few years ago, the Dolphin emulator was fine for offline Melee, but hardly viable for netplay purposes. Netplay's reliance on an internet connection was to blame for this. Once ping was added to the equation, Dolphin suffered from far more latency than Melee players were willing to tolerate. Online Melee would remain a pipe dream until May 2016, when the long-awaited solution came in the form of faster Melee. FM shook the world by revealing that the Melee we had been used to for all those years was already subject to several hidden sources of latency. By modifying Dolphin to remove these sources of latency, Melee could be played with less latency than before. This meant that adding ping would bring the latency back to square one and allow people to play Melee online for the very first time. FM drew plenty of skepticism at first, but as we are all aware, it ended up being the real deal. I bring up FM because it gave birth to a concept that is relevant to our discussion. In order to compensate for external sources of latency being added, hidden sources of latency can be removed. In this case, the external latency we are concerned with is an LCD monitor's visual delay. Luckily for us, the hidden sources of latency I'm referring to aren't Dolphin exclusive. This is because they stem from issues with the publicly released Melee disk itself. When Hall Laboratory developed Melee, they failed to synchronize certain in-game processes. In particular, there is a process called the read alarm that runs at 60 Hz, or 60 times per second. The read alarm interprets controller inputs and deems them suitable to display on the upcoming frame. A separate process called the game engine, which is responsible for generating frames of data, then follows suit at 60 Hz. Naturally, a 60 Hz read alarm and game engine should be paired with hardware that is capable of displaying 60 frames per second. The problem is that an NTSC GameCube's display rate is capped at 59.94 Hz. This desync isn't game-breaking, which is likely why it was overlooked. Upon closer inspection, though, it creates issues that cause Melee to run slower than it should. In total, Melee is delayed by 20.83 milliseconds as a result of Hall Laboratory's mistake. This is equivalent to 1.25 frames, since one frame lasts 16.67 milliseconds. To understand where this number comes from, I will explain each of the sources of latency that are present on the Melee disk. The first source of latency doesn't have a formal name, but I'll call it the visual buffer. As I said earlier, Melee runs on a 60 Hz read alarm and game engine, while the GameCube's display rate is 59.94 Hz. This means that there is initially a desync between the game's data and the game's graphics. To be precise, on each frame of a Melee match, the GameCube is being instructed to display slightly more than one frame of visuals. As time goes on, these fractions of a frame accumulate, and by no later than frame 1000 of a match, the math adds up such that the GameCube is told to display 2 fully completed frames at once. The problem is that once this happens, the GameCube doesn't handle the situation cleanly. From this point on in the match, the controller's inputs will correspond with the most recently generated frame, while the visuals being displayed will correspond with the second most recently generated frame. In other words, the game's visuals will now lag behind by an entire frame. This phenomenon, which we'll call the visual buffer, is responsible for 1 frame of visual latency. At this point, you might be wondering why the visual buffer doesn't continue to accumulate every time 1,000 frames go by. Based on the information I've given so far, it would make sense for Melee's visuals to lag behind by another frame at the 2,000 frame mark, the 3,000 frame mark, and so on. The only reason this doesn't happen is that Melee's 60Hz engine adjusts to 59.94 Hz the moment the first visual buffer is stored. This puts an end to the desync between Melee's data and the GameCube's display rate, but unfortunately it does create a separate issue. The second source of latency on the Melee disk is known as the polling drift. The polling drift results from the adjustment I just described, where Melee's game engine lowers from 60 Hz to 59.94 Hz in order to match the GameCube's display rate. This prevents the visual buffer from accumulating, but it creates another problem. Now the read alarm isn't synchronized with the game engine. To understand the problem this causes, let's take a look at a diagram of Melee's polling processes. At the top is the read alarm, which always operates at 60 Hz. At the bottom is a 60 Hz game engine, which Melee had prior to the visual buffer being stored. Because both of these processes ran at 60 Hz, both of their intervals lasted 16.67 milliseconds. Under this system, there were no issues with synchronization. Once Melee's engine swaps to 59.94 Hz, this is no longer the case. Now the game engine's intervals last slightly longer than the read alarm's intervals, because the game engine's intervals are occurring less rapidly. At this point, it is important to understand the relationship between the game engine and the read alarm. Twice per frame, the console pulls the GameCube controller, once at the start and once in the middle. This simply means that the console acknowledges the controller's inputs at these points in time. From there, the game engine relies on the read alarm to determine which inputs should go through to the next frame. To simplify this concept, a poll must be followed by a read alarm in order to count. On frame 0 of this diagram, for example, the poll at the start of the frame isn't followed by a read alarm, while the poll in the middle of the frame is followed by a read alarm. This means that only the poll in the middle of frame 0 actually matters, because it is the poll that will have its inputs displayed on frame 1. The same is also true for all of the other frames shown on this diagram. The key thing to notice though is that as each frame goes by, the read alarm gradually creeps up on the game engine. To be clear, this is because a process that is running at 60 Hz is occurring more rapidly than a process that is running at 59.94 Hz. To understand the math behind this, consider the visual buffer issue I described earlier. The visual buffer stemmed from an identical desync, and it took 1,000 frames in order for a full frame of delay to manifest. This means that it will take 500 frames for the polling drift to manifest, because the polling drift has to do with half-frame intervals. Going back to our diagram, once frame 500 is reached, the read alarm will have crept up on the game engine by enough for it to go past the poll in the middle of each frame. This phenomenon is known as the polling drift. Once the polling drift has happened, the read alarm will correspond with the poll at the start of each frame. This will remain true until another 500 frames go by. The difference between the read alarm corresponding with the poll in the middle of each frame and the poll at the start of each frame has to do with input latency. Because the middle of a frame is 8.33 milliseconds before the next frame, while the start of a frame is 16.67 milliseconds before the next frame, there is less input latency when the poll in the middle of each frame is used. The polling drift causes Melee to alternate between these two phases every 500 frames. If we're to consider half a frame of input latency the baseline, then the polling drift is responsible for an extra half a frame of input latency half the time. This amounts to 4.17 milliseconds of input latency on average. Between the polling drift and the visual buffer, the CRT Melee we've been used to this whole time has been subject to 20.83 milliseconds of latency. In 2016, Faster Melee showed us that these latencies could be removed in order to counteract ping and make netplay viable. Similarly, it is possible for us to remove these latencies in order to counteract an LCD monitor's visual delay. Thanks to people like Achilles, Dan Salvato, and Taucon, there exist codes that fix the visual buffer and the polling drift on console. Since these codes were never considered for tournament play, they never made it to the spotlight, However, the current generation's need for LCDs may finally give them their time and place. That brings me to the implications of all of this information. The first point of contention I'd like to raise actually doesn't have to do with just LCDs. During the polling drift section of this video, I described an issue that causes Melee's input delay to endlessly fluctuate between half a frame and a full frame. In my opinion, the community should consider standardizing the code that fixes this even at CRT Melee tournaments. Some of the reasons I believe fixing the polling drift should be fixed include: 1. Unlike a consistent source of latency such as the visual buffer, the polling drift causes latency to fluctuate, which has no place in a competitive game. 2. We've already made the decision to standardize 100% dashback, which means we're in favor of removing sources of inconsistent polling. And 3. The polling drift is already secretly fixed on netplay, which means most players are already used to it being fixed. Finally, that brings me to the purpose of this video, which is what the future holds for LCD monitors being used at Melee tournaments. Using all possible combinations of the lag reduction methods I've shown so far, it is possible to expedite Melee by the following amounts of time: 4.17 milliseconds by fixing only the polling drift, 16.67 milliseconds by fixing only the visual buffer, and 20.83 milliseconds by fixing both the visual buffer and the polling drift. Additionally, 2 more codes are being worked on behind the scenes. Once these codes are finalized, they will fix the visual buffer only halfway in order to unlock 2 more options, 8.33 and 12.5 milliseconds. As of the making of this video, these 2 codes are available, but they have not been thoroughly tested. The same is true for the code that fixes the visual buffer exclusively. As for my thoughts on these individual codes, I'll start from the top. In my opinion, the polling drift fix should be standardized across the board. Regardless of whether or not this happens, the 20.83 millisecond code reduces latency by too much and shouldn't be used long term. I know this because my tournament series currently runs on this code. Even though it has been positively received, I consider it a temporary solution until the codes that reduce latency by less are ready. Once the 8.33 and 12.5 millisecond codes are finalized, I predict that they will be the best ones for tournament use. The 12.5 millisecond code will be appropriate in a world where the Melee community standardizes the polling drift fix, and the 8.33 millisecond code will be appropriate if the polling drift fix isn't standardized. These codes will most likely bring LCDs as closely in line with CRTs as possible without going overboard. Keep in mind though that these are my preliminary opinions and that they are subject to change. If you're interested in using any of these codes, I provided a download link to all of them in the video description. The only equipment that you will need to use these codes is an SD card and a Wii that has Nintendo installed. If you're using an LCD, then you will need an HDMI converter as well. These cost about $10 on Amazon. For the time being, please know that all of these codes only work on NTSC 1.02. I should also mention that if the Melee community ends up approving of these codes, they can easily be added to Universal Controller Fix memory cards. This will make them even more accessible for tournaments to use. In closing, I'd like to give a huge thanks to everyone involved in the making of this video. The need for LCDs has been made loud and clear within the Melee community, so I'm hoping that our collective effort encourages people to give them a shot. As this project moves forward, I'll be sure to provide updates on any new findings as well as any new codes that are released.